have quite the video, but I must warn you, it's not for the faint of heart. We're about to plunge into one of the most insane, downright disturbing chapters of hidden history you're likely to ever come across. We actually stumbled upon this while researching for an elusive lost film that will be unraveling in the next few videos. But this information was so mind-shattering that it screamed for its own spotlight, its own dedicated video, before we even begin to tackle that. This connects with several of our other videos, such as the Cabbage Babies, but we could have never imagined how deep this rabbit hole truly goes. Our journey began innocently enough, with research into an old novel. That breadcrumb led us to another novel, more intricate, more detailed, peppered with historical references. And folks, this isn't no mere science fiction or fantasy romp. What we're going to be discussing today is an ancient art. I mean, if you can even call it that. But apparently that's how they perceived it. What we're dealing with is a lost art and science of a global secret society that was involved in some horrific experiments. This secret club was known as the Comprachicos, or the Child Buyers, and they were commissioned by royalty and elite figures for the creation of monsters. But it gets worse. What we're discussing is the dark, twisted origins of laughter. That's right. These noble families were apparently commissioning this secret group for the creation of hunchbacks, buffoons, and other strange-looking creatures for their own entertainment. Ridiculous as it may seem, it is a historical fact. Furthermore, the technology at the time was capable of doing this. It's just that the progress was done in secret. The Comprachicos were a hideous and nondescript association of wanderers, famous in the 17th century, forgotten in the 18th, unheard of in the 19th. The Comprachicos are not thought of as a consciously created group, but an ancient natural manifestation of the deep parts of human ugliness. This mysterious group has left their traces in the penal laws of Spain and England. You find here and there in the dark confusion of English laws the mark of this horrible truth, like the footprint of a savage in a forest. Comprachicos, the same as Comprachicos, is a compound Spanish word signifying child buyers. The Comprachicos traded in children. They bought and sold them. They did not steal them. The kidnapping of children is another branch of industry. And what did they make of these children? Monsters. Why monsters? Well, to laugh at. The populace must laugh, and kings too. The mountebank is wanted in the streets, the jester at the Louvre. The first is called a clown, the other a fool. The efforts of man to provide himself with amusement are at times worthy of the attention of the philosopher. This could very well be a chapter in the most terrible of books. Perhaps it would be entitled The Farming of the Unhappy by the Happy. Children have value, and since early savage times have constituted a special trade. This trade involved the creation of certain creatures, as this process was necessary to begin at an early age. The dwarf must be fashioned when young. A well-formed child was not amusing enough to these people. A hunchback was more fun. Hence came a twisted art. Trainers who took a man, take his face and make a muzzle. The ability to stunt growth, distorting the features as they pleased. It was as if they knew this was a mockery to God. They were the connoisseurs of caricature. This group did not do this just to humans, but also to animals. They invented piebald horses. The court buffoon was one of these experiments to bring man back closer to a monkey. But at the same time, these nobles even had a tiny monkey for a servant that they attempted to treat like a man. The nobles even had tea served by a baboon clad in gold brocade, which her ladyship called "my black." There were many elites who featured monkeys as high-class servants, which served as a counterpoise to men brutalized and bestialized. The dwarfs were one of the experiments of this lost art. By using certain oils, the sculptor could inhibit the growth of the spine, creating miniature humans or vice versa. They could influence the ligaments through traction to elongate and create giants. One of the proofs of this is the portrait of Geoffrey Hudson, the dwarf of Henrietta of France, daughter of Henry IV and wife of Charles I. The beings were created for amusement. The dwarf of the Elector Palatine Perkio, whose effigy springs from a magical box in the cave of Heidelberg, was a remarkable specimen of this science which varied in its application. Dr. Conquest, member of the Almond Street College and judicial visitor of the chemist shops of London, wrote a book in Latin on this pseudo-surgery. According to Justice of Carrickfergus, the inventor of this branch of surgery was a monk named Avonmore, an Irish word signifying great river. It would seem that the manufacturing of these monstrosities was practiced on a large scale and comprised various branches. For some reason, these creatures were useful to voluptuousness and to religion. They were not capable of reproduction, apparently. This now explains more clearly the use of the imagery of the monstrous races of Christianity. Perhaps this comes from a time when these beings were being created in mass, the creation of show monsters. They knew how to produce things in those days which are not produced now. They had talents which we lack, and it is not without good reason that the decline has come. We no longer know of the lost art of sculpting living human flesh. This is a consequence of torture methods losing their prevalence in society. In the cutting up of man, which can be traced back to ancient Rome, phenomena were grasped on the moment and discoveries were made. These experiments over time were renounced as the populace began to redevelop their lost souls. This, of course, resulted in limiting the progress of horrifying experimental surgeries, which were so common to these abhorrent medieval physicians. The vivisection of former days was not limited to the manufacture of phenomena for the marketplace, of buffoons for the palace, and eunuchs for sultans and popes. It abounded in varieties. One of its supposed achievements was the manufacture of cocks for the King of England. It was a custom in the palace of the kings of England to have a watchman who crowed like a cock. This watcher, awake while all others slept, ranged the palace and raised from hour to hour the cry of the farmyard, repeating it as often as was necessary, and thus supplying the place of a clock. This servant was operated on as a young child and would undergo an operation of the pharynx, which is a procedure described by Dr. Conquest. This eventually disgusted one of the duchess, and they had to swap this cockman for an unmutilated servant. The Comprachicos had a genius for this type of dismemberment. They worked on a man as the Chinese work on trees. They had their secrets, and as we've mentioned, they had tricks which are now lost arts. They could touch up a little being with such skill that its father would not have recognized it. Sometimes they left the spine straight and just remade the face. Children destined for tumblers had their joints dislocated in a masterly manner, thus gymnasts were made. Not only did the Comprachicos deprive a child of his natural lineaments, not only did they take the face away from the child, but they also took away his memory. At least, they took away all they could of it, as the child had no consciousness of the mutilation to which he had been subjected. This frightful operation left its traces physically, but not mentally. The Comprachicos deadened the little patient by means of a stupefying powder, which was thought to be magical and which suppressed all pain. This powder has been known from time immemorial in China and is still employed there. As we're on China, let us linger a moment to note another peculiarity. In China, from time immemorial, they have displayed a marvelous refinement in industry and art. They perhaps invented the art of molding a living man. They take a child, 2 or 3 years old, put him in more or less a grotesque porcelain vase, which is made without top or bottom to allow egress for the feet and head. During the day, the vase is set upright, and at night is laid down to allow the child to sleep. Thus, the child thickens without growing taller, filling up with his compressed flesh and distorted bones the depressions in the vase. This development in a bottle continues many years. After a certain time it becomes irreparable. When they consider that this is accomplished and the monster made, they break the vase. The child comes out and behold, there's a man in the shape of a mug. This became convenient as by ordering your dwarf, you're able to have him in any shape you wish. So all of this is from a chapter of a 1869 historical novel, The Man Who Laughs by Victor Hugo. Now this book is pretty much the wellspring of the Joker from Batman, but there's so much more to this tale than just a permanent smile. It's the backstory, the hidden depths of this narrative that are truly jaw-dropping. Now, there is a wiki page that dismisses all of this as mere folklore, but let me tell you something. That doesn't seem to be the case in the book. Hugo's masterpiece is a goldmine of historical details, from the intricacies of nobility, the laws that govern society, to alternative names for these groups like the Hindu Chelas. Here's where it gets wild. Dwarves, it seems, were more than just prized by nobility, they were crafted. Yeah, you heard that right, not born, but artificially constructed by medieval physicians. And how would they do this, you might ask? By anointing infant spines with the grease of bats, moles, and dormice. By employing drugs like dwarf elder knotgrass and daisy juice. Shakespeare himself knew of these practices, as evidenced by a quote from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Quote, "Get you gone, dwarf, you minimus of hindering knotgrass maid." End quote. But the rabbit hole goes deeper. Beyond dwarfs, we have other bizarre creations, like the buffoon. These were men manipulated to resemble monkeys and have their intelligence dulled. Ever call someone a buffoon for acting silly? Well, that term has its roots in a time when artificially created oddities were novelties in the courts of kings, and creating them might have been quite the lucrative gig. This wasn't a trend that was just confined to creating dwarfs or buffoons. This was a widespread practice in numerous areas of entertainment. Take for instance the creation of the castrato. This was a male classical singer who had been castrated before puberty, all to preserve an ethereal, angelic voice. You see, by ensuring the singer never hit sexual maturity, an endocrinological curveball of sorts, his larynx wouldn't be subject to the typical transformations brought on by puberty. This allowed for a one-of-a-kind development of the voice. The castrato didn't just show up in the opera, they dominated the scene, playing parts in some of the earliest ones dating all the way back to the early 1600s. But there's more. Think foot binding, a widely popular practice in 17th century China. This painful custom involved breaking young girls' feet and tightly binding them to drastically alter their shape and size. The result? Lotus feet, miniaturized versions that look something out of a cartoon. Though it was a status symbol in Imperial China, the practice imposed lifelong disabilities and severely limited the woman's mobility. Of course, many of you will be familiar with other body modifications like cranial deformation, but to really delve into the darker, more twisted corners of this art, we need to venture into stories often dismissed as folklore. The Mbunche is a short person in southern Chile legend. However, the story behind this creature may be relevant to our investigation. The Mbunche was a deformed human with its head twisted backwards, along with having twisted arms, fingers, nose, mouth, and ears. The creature walks on one foot, or on 3 feet actually, one leg and 2 hands, because one of the legs is attached to the back of its neck. According to the legend, the Mbunche is a firstborn child less than 9 days old that was kidnapped or sold by parents to a brujo, or a witch. This witch uses unknown black magic to transform the child into a horrible, deformed, hairy monster, first by breaking their right leg and twisting it over their back. When the child is 3 months old, their tongue is forked, their teeth turn sharp, their skin turns blue, and the warlock applies a magic cream onto the child's back that causes thick hairs. During its first months, the creature is fed on black cat's milk and goat flesh, and when it's old enough, dead human corpses from the cemeteries. Although this has been interpreted as magical folklore, there are elements of gradual mutilation and artificial design, as some aspects of the legend mention that this disfigured being had been sutured, tied, and bound from birth. Also, did you know there's a Universal film titled The Man Who Laughs from 1928 that touches on this chilling narrative? The plot centers around a noble exile who refused to kiss King James II's hand. His punishment? His young son, Gwynplaine, gets mutilated. The king's jester is the one who sells the boy to the Comprachicos surgeon, while the boy's father, Lord Clancharlie, meets his end in an Iron Maiden. The movie doesn't go too deep into the story of the Comprachicos at all really, but there's a section that shows how the story begins, with laws being placed in England trying to outlaw the Comprachicos, and we get a brief history of them brought up on the screen. Quote, the Comprachicos being gypsy traders in stolen children, and practicing certain unlawful surgical arts whereby they carve the living flesh of these children and transform them into monstrous clowns and jesters. Therefore all Comprachicos are hereby banished from England under pain of death. King James. End quote. We won't unpack the entire storyline here, but in a nutshell, the child is abandoned to prevent the Comprachicos from getting convicted, and the young boy embarks on a bleak journey, eventually stumbling upon another small child who survived a brutal snowstorm. They are discovered by Ursus, a pivotal character, an old man with a philosophical bend, and a wolf for company, who runs a traveling sideshow. As the children grow older, love blossoms between them. Ursus writes the plays, while the duo performs the shows, and Gwynplaine, our laughing man, begins to attract attention. One fateful day, one of the Comprachicos happens to see one of these shows, recognizes Gwynplaine, and writes a letter to Duchess Josiana, an influential figure in the court who is, in fact, meant to marry Gwynplaine. The plot thickens as they attempt to force Gwynplaine to resume his noble birthright despite his deformity. But Gwynplaine refuses, breaks free from his confinement, and returns to his beloved show family. It's quite the wild tale, but the crux of the narrative hinges on this historical gang, even referred to as a type of club within the story. There's so much more to unpack, but we'll pause here. If there's even a shred of truth to unlawful surgeries dating back to the 17th century, what does this tell us about the history of genetic manipulation or vivisection? Clearly, the art of sculpting or manipulating the human body predates the 20th century. And what if it gave rise to monsters or hybrid creatures? Could we be looking at a form of grafting not confined to plants, but extended to the manipulation of humans and animals? So what do you think? Is this just a terrifying legend, or does it carry a kernel of historical fact? All we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?